obìnrin kò kúrò nílé ọkọ o obìnrin kò kúrò nílé ọkọ ó káyé àṣẹ nílé baálé.
Welcome back, listeners, to Sandman Stories Presents, a folklore podcast where I read you to sleep or until the next story. I'm your host, Dustin. Today we are back in the book of Nigerian folklore, written down by M.I. Ogumefu. In the first story, the tortoise keeps his word, but the king doesn't at first. In the second story, Tortoise wants to know how Mr. Fly keeps his family so well fed. And in the final story, we see how Tortoise tricks the strongest in the land. Okay, let's begin. Tortoise and the King. One year the elephant had done a great deal of damage, breaking down the trees and drinking up the water in a time of scarcity, and eating the first tender crops from the fields. The king's hunters tried in vain to destroy him, for Elephant knew many charms and always escaped from their traps. At last the king offered the hand of his daughter in marriage to anyone who would rid the country of the pest. Tortoise went to the palace and offered to catch the elephant, and then made his preparations. Outside the town, a large pit was dug, and on top of it was laid a thin platform covered with velvet cloths and leopard skins, like a throne. Then Tortoise set off into the forest, accompanied by slaves and drummers. Elephant was very much surprised to see his little friend Tortoise riding in such a state, and suspected a trap, but Tortoise said that the old king was dead, and the people all wished the elephant to rule over them, because he was the greatest of all animals. When he heard this, Elephant was flattered, and agreed to accompany Tortoise to the town. But when he went up on the platform to be crowned king, the wood gave way beneath him, and he crashed down into the pit, and was speedily slain by the king's hunters. All the people rejoiced and praised the cunning of the tortoise, who went to the palace to receive his bride. But the king refused to give his daughter to such an insignificant creature, and Tortoise was determined to have revenge. When the new crops were just ripening, he called together all the field mice and elves, and asked them to eat up and carry away all the corn. They were only too pleased with the idea, and the farmers in distress found their fields quite bare. Now there was a prospect of famine in the land, and the king offered the same reward as before to anyone who would rid the country of the pests. Tortoise once again appeared in the palace and offered his help. The king was eager enough to accept it, but Tortoise cautiously refused to do anything until the princess had become his bride. The king was thus forced to consent to the marriage, and when it had taken place, Tortoise, true to his word, called together all the mice and elves and showed them a platform loaded with dainty morsels of food. He then addressed them as follows: "The people are so distressed at the damages you have done that they have prepared this feast for you, and they promise to do the same twice every year before the harvesting of the first and second crop, if you will agree to not touch the corn in the fields." The little creatures all consented and marched in a great crowd to the platform, which they soon cleared. The king and his people were not very pleased to hear of this arrangement, but they were so afraid of Tortoise that they could not complain, and after that the mice and elves never troubled the country again. The end. Okay, and story number 2, Tortoise and Mr. Fly. Once Tortoise and his family fell on hard times, and they had nothing to eat, but they noticed that their neighbor, Mr. Fly, seemed to be very prosperous and feasted every night. Tortoise was curious to know how he obtained so much money, and after watching him for some days, he discovered that Mr. Fly flew away every morning early with a large empty sack on his back, and returned in the evening with the sack full, and after that his wife would prepare a feast. One morning, Tortoise hid in the sack and waited to see what would happen. Soon Mr. Fly came out of his house, lifted up the sack, and flew away. He descended at last in the marketplace of a large town, for the drummers were beating the tones of the dance, and maidens were dancing before the crowd of people. Mr. Fly laid his sack on the ground, and Tortoise saw him standing beside one of the drummers. When the people threw money, Mr. Fly picked up the coins and hid them in his sack, and by evening he had collected a great quantity. Then he took up the sack and flew home. Tortoise quickly got out and took most of the money with him, so that poor Mr. Fly was surprised to find his sack almost empty. This happened several times, until one day, as he put the money in the sack, Mr. Fly caught sight of Tortoise hiding inside it. He was very angry at the trick, and going to the drummer, he asked him if he had missed any money. "Yes," said the drummer. "For some days I have been losing coins." "Look inside this sack," replied Mr. Fly, "and you will see the thief sitting among the money he has stolen." The drummer peeped inside the sack and saw Tortoise. "How shall the thief be punished?" he cried angrily. "Just tie up the sack," said Mr. Fly, "and then beat upon it as if it were a drum." So the drummer tied up the sack and beat upon it, until Tortoise was black and blue, and this is why his back is covered with bruises. Then Mr. Fly picked up the sack and flew high up in the sky and dropped it. By chance the sack fell down just outside of Tortoise's house, and the neighbors came to tell Nyanribo, his wife, that someone had left a present outside the door. But when she opened the sack in the presence of a crowd of people, she found only Tortoise inside, more dead than alive. Then Mr. Fly made a song and narrated the whole story, and the drummers also played it, and Tortoise and Narimbo were so ashamed that they left the place and went to live in another country. The end. Okay, and the third story, Erin and Erinomi, the land and water elephants. Tortoise was always fond of making mischief between harmless people. One day he walked along the riverbank and he came upon the elephant and said to him, "The hippo is boasting that you are only a weakling, and that you do not have the strength to pull a log out of the river." "That is false," cried the elephant, and to prove his strength he allowed Tortoise to tie a strong rope to his trunk and attach the other end to a log in the river. Tortoise went down to the water holding the rope and said to Hippo, "The elephant is boasting of his strength, and he declares that you are a weakling and could not pull down a tree." "That is false," cried the hippo. "I can pull down any tree." Tortoise then said that he had attached his rope to a tree, and he would fasten the other end to Hippo's horn. This he did, and the two animals began to pull, one on each end of the rope. Elephant pulled, and the hippo pulled, and neither gave way. After some time Hippo rested, and Elephant came down to the water to quench his thirst. And then they saw the trick that had been played on them. Snorting with anger, they began to look for the mischievous Tortoise, but by this time he was, as you may be sure, very, very far away. The end. I loved having these three stories about the tortoise this time around. The first one was pretty cool, and I liked how the tortoise got what was his. The second one gave me a bit of a laugh because I was thinking about a Lao folktale about flies that I hope to cover someday. And the third one was almost exactly Brother Rabbit's story that I've read in multiple places, including the Louisiana folktales. You can see how the stories have migrated over to America along with the people. There are 3 more tales of tortoise in this book, and then the book will be done, and I'll probably replace it with Zanzibar tales. This week's podcast shoutout is to Inside the Great Khan's Tent, hosted by Saif Beg. This podcast covers folk tales from the Islamic world, including some that I haven't heard of. He also has a lot of knowledge about history and folk tales in the Middle East and the Asian steppe areas. So, have a seat in his yurt, drink a cup of chai, and settle in for a story. And if you like his podcast as much as I do, go give him a listen, a rating, and a review. And the listener shout-out is to the entire nation of Vanuatu. This island nation was first populated about 3,000 years ago. Sadly, because of kidnapping and population separation, much of the pre-European history has been destroyed, intentionally or otherwise. Likely the original people came from Taiwan or the Philippines and are closely related to the Melanesians and the people of the Solomon Islands. They met the Portuguese, French, and British, who all tried to name the islands a variety of names, but none of them stuck. The only name that stayed is Port Vila, and that became the capital and the largest city. There are 113 languages on the island, but the main one spoken is Bislama, a relative of Tok Pisin and Solomon Island Pidgin. I would love to visit, and so to my listener in Vanuatu, I say, thank you, Tumas, and good night. Thank you very much, and good night.